It's not because I love the sound of my own voice. Welcome to the third Bordeaux Masterclass. When I look back at the start of coronavirus, I find it a little hard to believe that what started as a, hey, what the hell do we do now with our winery, to, I guess, a full-blooded program of these running around. We're very lucky to have had great support and great coverage, and I really appreciate you taking the risk. Those who haven't had the benefit of going through this with us, welcome, and I hope you enjoy it. And those who are returning, I obviously didn't do anything too bad last time. So as I said, I've got a bit of a PowerPoint presentation. The first thing I'd love to do is if a show of hands, people here are Bordeaux wine lovers or Bordeaux wine amateurs. Would you like to, has everyone here drunk a Bordeaux, or has it's got that in the background, or? It's all right. Well, tonight you're going to find out a little bit more about it. I think you'll probably find that you don't have to drink the French stuff to get a very good example of their style of winemaking. So without further ado, I'll start the program. So yeah, it's interesting. It's evolved. Each time there's a little bit more intricacy to it. So Bordeaux Masterclass. So very, very quick background for those of you who are joining and don't know much about us, whether you've been given tickets or referred to join. We're a small little family winery. We are based at Rylstone, which is a new wine region within the Central Ranges, so south of Mudgee, back towards Sydney, so about 3 hours from Sydney. We're about 40 minutes from Mudgee, about an hour from Bathurst. Beautiful area of the world, very old, very historical for Australia. Nowhere near as old as what we're going to talk about tonight. Obviously founded by my parents now 23 years ago. But previously, we've been making wine in the Yarra Valley since 1970 with my dad's aunt and uncle, and my cousin Hugh still makes wine there and in the Mornington Peninsula. So we're Victorians. So I'll explain a little bit of background there, why Victorians are in New South Wales. We are a terroir-focused French style producer. I'll explain a little bit about that. And we're, interestingly enough, I think a lot of you are probably looking at this presentation and with the great Australian accent and going there, are we on for a bridge tone or Michelin night tonight? Our family is in fact from Burgundy. So it's interesting that there's one of the great rivalries in the world with the French world is Bordeaux versus Burgundy. It's almost the equivalent of probably Australia versus New Zealand in terms of the bickering that will go on. And but for us, there's a rationale for it, and it's by the styles that we make, and because we're Australian. But our roots are in Burgundy, and that has given us the platform from which we make a lot of our wine making decisions, and it made a lot about our terroir selection, our site selection, where we chose to plant the vineyard. We come at this industry from quite a different angle to most of the rest of the Australian wine industry, and I think that will be important to sort of use it as differentiation. It's not an indictment. I think Australian wine is the best in the world. And I'm happy to sit in the New South Wales Wine Board and say New South Wales probably is one of the best representations of that with our diversity. But we have our own approach, and that's the great thing about the new world is we can do a bit of everything. And we can pay homage to the old, and we can do the new as well. And in 2018, we were awarded Best Wine in Australia, which was a bit of a unique achievement for a tiny little business. So my sister there on the left, my parents in the middle. So we're all involved. My sister in particular looks after all of our directs. So if you're a wine club member or you've dealt Cellar Door or online, she runs that side of the business and obviously helps do a lot of the back end systems, all our websites and everything like that. And my first little daughter there on the right, Annabelle, and we've got, which we've named our Sparkling Cremant after. And we've got another daughter, Sophie, who will now have to name another wine after, and my lovely partner, Megan, on the end. So French wine. What does French style wine? It sort of sounds a bit elusive. It sounds like a bit of a marketing term. It does need a definition. And this is sort of the way we've talked about it. So it's about elegance and balance, and that's really important because it's designed to complement food. It's not designed to be an overpowering on the palate. It's supposed to be about having the right amount of acid and the right amount of flavor. It's sort of things in tune. And most importantly, from my perspective, from a wine quality perspective, it's quite easy to engineer a wine. I say easy, it's a scale of ease. It's very hard, but when it gets to that point, it's easier to engineer a great wine in the short term to win a couple of trophies. It's the ability for a wine to be great over 20, 30 years of aging, which to me is the real benchmark for great wines. That's something we aspire to do. We are obviously all about our terroir, and it's limestone based, which is important. And the French, because they are very vineyard centric, it's about vintage variations. From an Australian perspective, the vineyard has played a second fiddle. I always use we do a lot with a lot of the good restaurants in Australia, and I talk to them about name the best 10 winemakers in Australia, and they can name that. And I say, name the 10 best vineyards in Australia, and they really struggle. And it's the other way around in France. You can name the 10 best vineyards, but you won't name the 10 best winemakers for a very good reason. And it's also about minimal intervention. So what we're talking there is if you've got this beautiful vineyard, you've got this right location, you don't want to start altering the product. Winemaking is a very heavy hand on the provenance of the fruit. And so not saying we're going natural, but we're saying that it's about understanding and limiting the involvement of yourself in the process to try and let the vineyard, the location talk to you. And obviously about working with the environment. So the French are very big on biodynamics and everything. We are regenerative. So we're classified sustainable, but we've moved to regenerative now, which is about improving what we have, not just maintaining it. So which we'll come to. It's really important from a wine quality perspective too. So now, those of you, I'm sorry, who've got their wine and those who don't, the danger I found with these is there's a lot of talk. So one, as I said, put your hands up, jump in if you have any questions. But the danger is as you get to the end and people don't realize that they should have been drinking. So if you've got some wine there, not ours, I'm sorry for Maureen. The first bottle is the Semillon Sauvignon Blanc. Please feel free to open it. And I will talk a bit about the wine and it'll all sort of come together as we process along the way. But the first bottle, being a Semillon Sauvignon Blanc, is an interesting bottle. So it's not the same style as you would see here in Australia at all. It's a style of wine that comes from Bordeaux. So Semillon is called Bordeaux Blanc. The name should give it a little bit away, but stepping back before that, historically, the area of Bordeaux is Basque countryside. It was the land of the Vasconais and the Aquitaine. They were pre-Celtic people, and you can see there on the top right the spread of the Basque. So back at the time of the Roman era, Bordeaux was well within the Basque sphere of influence. Now you know of them more in the northern area of Spain, where they're interestingly enough, they are very famous for their sailing. Most of the Spanish explorers were in fact Basque sailors, and those people, the same people, obviously spread more widely and covered the area that is now classified as the Bordeaux wine region. And being great sailors, what they used to use, especially back in the historical times, was they used to fish over long distances, chasing cod in particular, and these were obviously found all across the Atlantic, arguably apparently off Canada. They were fishing back in BC, so over 2,000 years ago off Canada. There's incredible boats that you see down here. So it's a bit very similar to the Vikings in terms of their long boats and their ability to ride long distances. They catch these fish and they bring them back to market throughout Europe. And this was pre-refrigeration. So the only form of preservation you had were drying or salt. And so they would use salt. So in these middle of these boats, you would have big, I guess at that stage, ceramic tubs or pots within which they would fill with salt, and they'd gradually layer the fish in them as they caught them, and they bring them back to market. And what this did was it ensured that their diet became incredibly salt-laden. And so the food of this area, especially the seafood of this area, became particularly salty. So I don't know if you've all can see what's in the bottom right and wondering what the hell is a Smith's packet of chips doing there. What's important to know is there's a reason why Arnott's or Smith's made salt and vinegar chips, because one of the greatest matches with salt is vinegar, is acid. And so when you're looking at a wine perspective, the best match with salt is a highly acidic wine. So this is when we're looking at this wine, which we're talking about now. There's a cultural reason Bordeaux Blancs, so Semillon made in Bordeaux, are much more acidic, much fresher, so more fruit-driven than say, a warmer climate Hunter Valley Semillon, is because they were designed for this very salt-laden diet. So that gives you the semblance. So obviously Semillon, the name should have always given it away. It's named after Saint-Emilion. I've played a little bit of a game there with the sign on the top left. It's interestingly enough, it was a variety that was planted around Bordeaux, but it was really planted much more heavily by the Dutch. And I won't preempt a large part of this discussion, but let's just say that they planted a lot of it. A lot of Bordeaux was white, interestingly, for a fair period of time. And it was really the impact of diseases like phylloxera, which enabled the replanting of whole areas of Bordeaux that moved them much more towards red. It's fascinating. Whereas you look at Champagne, it was actually traditionally a red wine area before it became more white wine. So phylloxera played its part. But Semillon was quite famous, and it's normally you see it around this area called Grave. So Grave is between the two rivers, and on the lower left bank in particular. So lower left bank, and then it sort of spreads into between the two rivers. It has different quality levels. Interestingly, right down at the bottom end, you have your Sauternes and your Barsac, which is your sweet wine areas, the lower lying areas alongside the river. And there's a very good reason they make sweet wines. The rest of Grave is a little bit higher, it can't produce the sweet wines. But you're moving right up to this area at the top called Pesach Leonard. Now, Pesach Leonard is arguably some of the best white wine in the world that they produce there. It's Semillon, interestingly. And the game is really given away by, I don't know if you've ever heard of a wine called Haut-Brion. So Haut-Brion is probably the most expensive white wine in the world. This was a wine of preference of Thomas Jefferson. So he used to drink a lot of Haut-Brion back in his day. And these days it sells for almost about $1,500 a bottle. So it's a fascinating area. So Semillon is very much Bordeaux's white. We've evolved it here in Australia. I think we're really great evolution in the Hunter Valley, very different climate and culture derived for the development of there. But this is the background to it. This is why we made it our way. Interestingly, we are not obviously Bordeaux, where we are Burgundian. We're looking for Burgundy, but we'll talk a little about that. Even though the French regions are quite different, on a scale of Australia, they are very similar. And there's a good reason behind that as well. So this is just an introduction to get you going, start you drinking the wine. So we've made this style Bordeaux Blanc. So we're looking here for a much higher level of acidity and freshness. And it's, as you can imagine, beautiful with salty seafood in particular. So salt and pepper squid would be an easy match for it, but you can get a little bit more complicated than that as well if you'd like. And that's just a little bit of a good comparison. Obviously, the different styles of Semillon. Tyrrell's that one of the great Semillons of the world. Much more rounded, so much lower acidity. That's driven by a much warmer climate, which we can, I say we're going to come to, because I'm sort of preempting a bit, but we can talk a little bit about that. It's important to understand the differentiation between a Hunter Valley Semillon and a Bordeaux Blanc. So Bordeaux Blancs would be much more around what Vas Felix is trying to do and the like over at Margaret River. Margaret River really has built itself around being Bordeaux in Australia. It's on the west coast. The ocean winds, the Fremantle Doctor comes in. It's right down there, and they obviously similar. They call it similar latitude, similar temperatures to an extent. And I think they've done a good job of representing what a Bordeaux Blanc tastes like. Obviously, the ways that we make them in Australia, they're not made to the same standard as an Haut-Brion. Haut-Brion has a very long time aged in oak, a number of years aged in oak, whereas we mainly use in Australia. That one will probably use a little bit of oak, but much more steel tank and freshness is the key. because even though we like to be influenced by the French schools and we like to use them as inspirations, there's also a commercial decision in Australia is you're not going to go and over invest in a wine like Semillon at the moment. I think definitely in the future, I definitely think it's a class that should evolve. It's one of the noble varieties of wine. But for us, we've kept it fairly simple. So mainly still tank, obviously about acidity. And you can see that there with these pH. Sometimes people like to see them, but what effectively you'll see is 3 down here. It's fascinating for a warm climate having such a low pH, and that's because they're picking it underripe or right on the edge of underripe. Whereas Haut-Brion is probably picking around where it's just about ripe. So they're looking for a bigger, bolder flavor alongside the acidity. It's fascinating. I don't know how they do this pH down here that low, and yet still have a different style of wine to the Burgundian. So it's for the Bordeaux. Anyway, that's just a very quick introduction to Semillon. For me, it's a very linear, easy drinking wine, not overly complicated. It did pretty well. I think at 91 points, which is a little surprising, because for me, we'd never really conceived of our Semillons being anything but a bit of a quaffer. So it's good to see they're developing a little bit of its own representation in the market. In terms of obviously that other bit of about Semillon, the good thing to think about it, as I mentioned, was a little bit further south, so Pesach Leonard, where the Haut-Brions are made, right up next to Bordeaux. As you get down the river, it gets down much more low-lying, and they get this sea fog that comes up the Gironde River. So this river becomes the Garonne, down this side of Bordeaux. And that brings this morning fog across the vineyard. And what that does is it enables this sort of, I guess, microclimate of humidity that's there in the morning. And that generates Botrytis, which you see here on the left, which is a mold. And effectively what Botrytis does is it feasts on the moisture within the berries and intensifies the juice and the sugar. So it pushes the residual sugar, because it's effectively like cordial. It's reduced the grapes. It's able to form best down in these lower lying areas around Sauternes in particular, in the river, because this fog is there in the morning, but then it burns away in the afternoon. It's really important that it burns away in the afternoon because you still need the grapes to ripen. So just a very humid environment that's constantly pushing this mold means that the mold does its job too quickly. So the sugar doesn't have time to develop, the flavor doesn't have time to develop, so you just end up with this it's dirty sour rot type of approach. You want a sweet rot, you want some sugar associated with it. It's really interesting. You can tell sour rot, you walk through the vineyard and it smells like vinegar. So it's able to achieve that in this Sauternes area, but the rest of Grave is just a little bit higher. It's just a little bit above the fog band, and it doesn't achieve it. We produce a Botrytis Semillon because we have our own river, and the corner of our property where we plant our Semillon and also our Viognier is covered in the same type of fog. It's pretty horrific. You can't see more than 3 meters when it's sitting across that part of the vineyard. It makes for interesting times. I remember my 21st, a number of my friends got lost. They said it was due to the fog. I thought it was due to the alcohol, but I've been out there enough times now to know, no, probably a bit of both. But we've been able to produce a sweet wine, similar experience, because it produces this Botrytis. And as we're trying not to spray as much, we decided to make a sweet wine in 2013 to reasonably good success. Came second in the New World behind Framingham in New Zealand, but we beat the Americans and South Americans, the South Africans, and the rest of Australia. We called it an El Dorado moment. It's one of those sort of not to be repeated things in the wine industry. Happens very often. You then spend the rest of your career trying to wear the underwear the same way and getting out of bed the same way, and what you did in the morning and who you talked to. So we didn't hold out high hopes so we could do it again. 2016, same level of fog came in, developed the Botrytis in a similar way. We gave it another crack. It was the wine that won best wine in Australia, which is a number of firsts for us. So first time in 40 years. So it's a wine state trophy. So 40-year trophy. First time in 40 years in New South Wales, wines won. First time in 40 years, a sweet wines won. And we thought we were just there to win the sweet wine trophy. We were outside celebrating. So we missed the actual grand trophy presentation. And it was the first time in 40 years I had to clap twice because I had to bring us back inside and clap again. So it was a bit of an upset. So we're now producing a number of sweet wines. So all I'm saying here is Semillon's been really interesting for us. We came at this as Burgundians, and I explained over the evening why we planted all these bloody other varieties. It was a commercial decision, being out in our own. And Semillon back in the 80s and 90s was what everyone wanted, interestingly enough, these days. And it's interesting that we've been able to go down one path and another path, and that comes down everything to terroir. So now we've talked a little bit about the Sem. We'll get back onto track, which is talking about terroir and getting into how Burgundy is what it is, and why and the wherefore and how they do it. And the first way to look at it is, I guess, to unpack the way that Australians think about terroir. And you hear it a lot. A lot of people talk about wine quality based on temperature. You hear cool climate. It's much better than warm climate. It's very misleading. And I think it's probably not for the dustbin, but it's definitely something you should listen to with skepticism. If you are using cool climate varieties from France, yes, it's probably more appropriate to be in a cool climate. But if you look at Hunter Valley up here, some of the best Semillon in the world, and you look at Bordeaux, where Semillon comes from, very different temperature. So straight away, you're losing the ability of experimentation to discover these opportunities. It's also what happens if you're trying to grow a warm climate variety. So if you're growing these new Spanish varieties are very trendy and popular, the Tempraneos, the Grenaches. Shiraz is actually, interestingly enough, a Spanish variety. You need to be chasing warmth. Same with Southern Italian, the Nero de Avalos or the Touriga Nacionals from Portugal. These are the next wave of grapes. You're going to see a lot of them in Australia because they're much more suited to our conditions. And they will grow a better wine in a warm climate. A cool climate, trying to plant one of these varieties will end up with an underripe fruit that'll be bitter and astringent, and you will not enjoy it. So great for, okay, cool climate. You want to grow something like the French? Perfect conditions. Go for it. That's it. Doesn't indicate anything more than that. Because the French come at wine using a much more holistic approach. They obviously, the vineyard is king. I don't know if you dealt with the Crus, the appellation system in France. You may be aware that in France, there is no term for winemaker. So you actually go and put into Google Translate winemaker, you'll get out vigneron. Vigneron is a person who identifies by his vineyard. And there's a reason for that, because they don't, these vineyards have evolved over thousands of years to be in the right location for their variety. The intervention and techniques in the winery are unnecessary often. And also, a lot of these vineyards are just too small to have really too much investment in the winery anyway. But they look at their wine through the prism, obviously, of climate. So cool, yes, it's important, but also what type of cool or what type of warm on the coast or inland has a very big part to play. Bordeaux and Burgundy is a tale of coast versus continental inland climate. Topography, so you hear Sauternes down a bit lower, down near the river where the fog could get to, a little bit higher, maybe up the slopes, the erosions strip the soils back. There's quite a few things that have to play there. The flora and fauna is important, from especially these days. Our understanding of fermentation has improved dramatically over the last 10 years here in Australia, and it's why you're seeing the use of native yeasts rather than just inoculated yeast. So we used to sterilize everything before we put it into winemaking, and then we'd use inoculated. So effectively, yeast you purchase from Lafort, one of the big chemistry companies, and those yeasts, the baker's yeast, they're fantastic for getting a wine up to 15% alcohol, but they're useless between 0 and 5% alcohol. And that's where a lot of your flavors are developed. And that's why, having a really healthy biome above ground as well as below ground has enormous part to play in the wine quality of, and also using Mother Nature to defend your vineyard. So using ladybirds and lacewings, the terrorists of pests in the vineyard. I know we all have these really lively views of how cute ladybirds are, but if you're a microscopic pest in the vineyard, they are absolutely terrifying. They're probably more like alien or predator than anything else. So trying to use insectariums, and they're using all sorts of things to effectively try and work around their vineyard. And it all obviously centers a lot around their soil. This is their much more holistic approach. Australians are moving there, and there's been a big evolution of thought towards this type of approach. But there's a reason we haven't been able to do it, because in Australia, wine was originally established by the English. And the English have a great trading history with wine, especially with Bordeaux, but they weren't the winemakers normally themselves. And being traders, they were much more driven by the economics of proximity to a railhead or a canal than they were to where a wine should be. So Busby in the Hunter Valley, he owned the land, he wanted to make wine, he planted it there. Then you had, obviously, the Germans came along, and they sort of got it. That's why you find that the Coonawarra and the Barossa and the like are actually remarkably similar to some of the soils that you see in France. There's a reason for that. And then obviously you've had the Italians who came here much more with an ethos of fruit growing. The Italians make some of the best wines in the world, but a lot of them who came to Australia were much more interested in planting orchards in the Mildura area, in the Riverlands area, and mass producing grapes than they were of trying to replicate Langy or somewhere else in Piedmont. So if you remember before, there was that discussion, there was the vertical of temperature. So this is sort of concertinaed out, that sort of a little bit more holistic. It can be quantitative. It's not just a qualitative discussion. You can test for what the French are looking to do. And the way that they achieve that, so I think I need to have a glass of wine. The way that they do that is you see is much more along this horizontal scale. And you see straight away at the bottom, it says average region soil pH. Now, there are outliers. I'll give you some qualifying remarks about this. These are averages. There are movement around either side of it. And two, it's not a quantifier of quality. The Hunter Valley, Hilltops, Beechworth produce amazing wines. And they're right over here. Very different to France. This is just if you're looking to chase French terroir to make French styles of wine using French varieties, you probably want to be in conditions similar to France. So all the French wines, as you'll see, are out. Amazingly, this is what I was saying is you think of the difference between Bordeaux and Burgundy in a bottle, and then you look at this chart and you realize from a terroir perspective, they've got a lot more in common than Australian regions, which are all over the place. And that's also our strength. Australian being all over the place means we're discovering things about wines. And we're going to show you tonight. We had a Burgundy ideal in our mind, and tonight we're talking about Bordeaux. And interestingly, our Bordeaux varieties at the moment are more famous than our Burgundy varieties. So this is a good way of looking at it. Obviously, where we are located, we're quite similar to Champagne, Burgundy, Bordeaux, and the like. So it's an interesting way to start. So how did this square come about? Because they're all in that square. I could put the rest in there too. It's sort of, there's a lot more when I'm talking about Burgundy, there's a lot more squiggles on this, but really it comes down to these two dashed purple lines. They define a lot about viticulture in France. And you can sort of see they normally encompass a lot of the French areas. There are some breakaways and there are some other bits and pieces that are similar, but really they all comes down to these lines. But I guess the first derivation, as I said, to go back into wondering a little bit more about it is understanding a little bit about Bordeaux's history. It was Bordeaux's history, I think, I call it a Game of Thrones. This is probably the most historically impacted wine region in the world. It's effectively a story of three countries, but best told probably starting back when it was an area called the Duchy of Aquitaine. And historical influence here is really, really important from a Bordeaux perspective, because you got here, obviously, what was France proper, and you had the duchies of Toulouse. Interestingly, Burgundy was sort of French proper, but not. Being Burgundian, we spent as much time fighting the French as we did the English. Duchy of Brittany and the Duchy of Normandy. So this is at a time back in the 1200s, thereabouts, 1200s, early 1300s. So this is just before the 100 Years' War. So it should have sort of set it all up. And you had this lovely lady here called Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was a very independent woman. So Aquitaine being what was quite close to the previous, what were then very culturally significant Islamic states in Spain, had much more international and worldly perceptions. They weren't as religious. You had some really interesting sects that developed there, the Cathars and the like. And she ended up marrying, because she has this duchy here, marrying the King of France, naturally, so that France can effectively expand its territory to cover what is now Bordeaux. And the problem was that she married Louis VII, who was so Louis VII was probably one of those all-time boring monarchs. He was the spare. So the oldest son died, and he was dragged out of monastic school where he was studying to be a priest and made king. And so he was all about, obviously, studying. And so he had this free-flowing southwestern French girl, very worldly, boredom extraordinaire. They went off in the Crusades together. And on the way, she fell in love with the Count of Anjou. And Anjou's on the river in the Loire Valley. And so she went to the Pope, and they effectively, she and Louis annulled their relationship. They'd had 2 daughters, so the 2 daughters were allowed to stay with Louis, and she was then free to marry Henry the Count of Anjou. Now, Henry the Count of Anjou is pretty well known. He became King Henry of France, of England. So I think it was the second. So at that time, England had the Duchy of Normandy. It was pretty close to the Duchy of Brittany, and they just picked up the Duchy of Aquitaine. So effectively, they dismembered France and given over an enormous amount of territory, including the very, very lucrative vineyards that were currently located in Bordeaux. And he, I guess that sort of sums it all up. I guess the interesting thing about Eleanor is her sons were obviously Richard the Lionheart and King John, or Prince John of that's why I've got Robin Hood or Men in Tights fame, and quite important there. That sort of that was kicked it off. You have Henry V, and it all ended up with Joan of Arc, and France was able to get back most of Bordeaux. And knowing that, understanding and appreciating that is you understand that effectively, for a long period of time in the Middle Ages, Bordeaux was English. It was Gascony. It wasn't French. And that's why you still see today a lot of the wineries there are owned by foreigners. And a lot of the Grand Crus, interestingly enough, including one of them that we base our rosé around, is in fact, they're named after English. There's one, it's Grand Cru, it's called Chateau Brown. It's a really French name, but it's a 1700s English wine merchant. So the English had a really, really strong history in this area of the world. The French regained it, but the English maintained it because there was a lot of money to be made out of the shipping of wine from Bordeaux. And I'll go into it as we get later on, but just understanding this is the place name, obviously where it comes from, and we'll start working out how putting all the pieces together with those 2 arcs. So you see the first one, obviously Aquitaine. There's a little bit of an Aquitaine basin here. And this is really where you get down more to the terroir focus of France in particular. And you see this Aquitaine basin, and you see a Paris basin. If you remember, those 2 purple dashed lines were effectively what they were. They were the horizon of these 2 basins. So you need to go back to the time of Sam Neill in Jurassic Park and remember that that the Northern Hemisphere in particular was a great supercontinent called Pangaea. And as it came to the end, as the continent started to pull apart, water from all the oceans around rushed into all the low zones and into the gaps and into the fissures, and obviously covered low-lying lands. And they were, in France's case, this Aquitaine basin, the Paris basin. So these became very shallow seas. So that stage, these nations, France was located on about the equator. So they were very warm seas, really lovely areas for obviously dinosaurs and the like. But also they were areas where you had an abundance of sea life. So within those shallow seas, you had enormous quantities of plankton. And the plankton, as they died and they layered onto the soil, they formed layers of great bands of chalk. So you can see it here in Champagne, obviously World War I battlefields, if that's of interest. And along the coastlines, much like Sydney, you get these deposits. You obviously get enormous quantities of shellfish thrive there. And so those areas, you can see here, they became limestone. And you can see it here in a Burgundy vineyard, here on the right, I'm holding up a fossilized shellfish. So the French vineyards, if you go back to that screen, are on these horizons. So Champagne was out inside the shallow sea. Burgundy, Loire Valley were on the Paris Basin shoreline. And Bordeaux was on the coastline of the Aquitaine Basin, the main plantings. And there was a little bits around here as well, but it makes the story. I can talk a lot longer about it, but I won't. And why that's important, why these vineyards are planted in these locations, really all it comes down to is a very simple understanding of gardening. If you've got a bit of a green thumb and you've got some struggling tomatoes in the back garden, you'll know that if you add a bit of ag lime, crushed up egg shells or the like, that your tomatoes will probably start performing a lot better because soils are naturally quite acidic. There's a reason for that. Is rain is quite acidifying, and as it leaches through the soil, it obviously leaves them quite acidic. Plus, also volcanic rock tends to be a little bit more acidic as well. So the way that gardeners achieve and obviously deal with this is they use lime from the surface down. But in Burgundy, Champagne, Loire, Bordeaux, Northern Rhone, even Alsace, do it from the bedrock up. Because they plant on these limestone or chalk deposits. And that's what gives them that higher pH over here. So that's how they end up at around 7.5, because that's what limestone's job or lime's job is to do, is to make a soil more alkaline. So the way that, take, for instance, over here, Coal River Valleys in Tasmania, the way that they overcome their acidic soils is they go out with tractors and a spreader, and they just spread an enormous quantity of lime through their vineyard. Problem is that it gets down 10 to 20 centimeters, maybe 30 centimeters, and it washes away. So you've got to reapply it quite often. But also a lot of that great root zone, the really important stuff, is around 50 centimeters, 30 to 50 centimeters deep, where you're just enough far away from the surface for it to start being significant. So these guys over here are a little bit more naturally able to achieve that alkalinity. And the reason all this comes down to, and I'm sorry if it's a bit of a chemistry exercise, but it's sort of important because this is what makes great wine. And this is, the French have worked this out through trial and error over 2,000 years of growing vines. And they planted vines a lot more locations, but they just stopped having them there. You can see right in the middle, that sort of 6.5 to 7.5, you get all of the available nutrients that the vines need to be healthy. So vines, like humans, we all need multivitamins. Effectively, they need minerals more so. And they are, in effect, looking for that in the soil because we wear our stomach on the inside. Plants wear their stomach on the outside. So their stomach, their biome is the soil. So in our stomach, you have obviously a gut biome. And when you have antibiotics, you wipe it out. And then you've got to go and get some Yakult and yogurt and lactobacillus and rebuild your stomach biome. And you know that when it's out of balance, it obviously impacts you quite negatively. And so plants are exactly the same. So when they've got access to all these minerals and nutrients accessibly, the biome is in effect operating really efficiently. So, and the way that they get access to these minerals isn't that the root takes a bit of copper. It's not the way it works. They need to be digested, broken down, and secreted by all of these microfauna, in particular the fungi and the bacteria and the like. So these healthy soils, happy soils, means that they're very efficient because they're making what the vines need easier. So efficiency is just like a car. It's what gets from A to B faster or less fuel, effectively. It's the same with soil. So if the vine's able to get the nutrients it needs with less of it, it has a really important benefit, because that healthy, happy, nutrition, efficient soil is the difference between what you see on the left, which is table grapes, and what you see on the right, which is wine grapes. There should be a bit of a giveaway. The giveaway is that the ones on the left are big. They're full of water and they've been diluted down for your enjoyment, to be honest. Wine grapes are not that refreshing. Trust me, I've tried. You have it quite a lot at the end of season, and they're very acidic. They're very full of sugar, and Yeah, they're nice with, maybe some cold cuts or something like that, but you're not going to eat a whole bunch of them. And because the wine grapes on the left, that's irrigation, or it's deep soil. So think of soils like water reservoirs. When it rains, deep soils means that the moisture is kept in larger volumes, which means the vines just keep drinking. So the vines don't need all this water. They're taking the water in for their fruit. So it's a bit like sheep's wool. The more nutrient, the greasier, the thicker the wool becomes. So you want it to be a little bit, we want the grape to be struggling a little bit, which is what you see on the right. These are grapes that aren't getting as much water. So it means that they're more intense, they're more flavoursome, there's much more structure there. And this is achieved, this is probably best showing. I always love showing it because people go, well, because people hear, and you still hear it, I don't know why people throw it around, oh, we've got these great deep soils. And I go, well, that's not a viticultural benefit. This here is the Louis Roederer Cristal Vineyard and Cremont Village, 50 centimeters of soil on straight into chalk. So very shallow. The actual areas in this area get down right down to 30 centimeters. So it's perfect countryside for Chardonnay in particular. Chardonnay doesn't like a lot of water. It's got very thin skins. It will obviously expand and it will then burst and it'll let disease in and it ruins it. It's not just quality, it's also disease issues as well. This is Domaine de la Rome di Conti, most famous vineyard in the world, pretty ordinary soil. And it's a benefit. So I don't know if anyone here is a wool classer or a sheep grazier or the like, but you'll appreciate that, crummier soil equates with better wool. So this soil, it's not crummy, it's got this high level of mild alkalinity, neutral. So the biome, the microorganisms, everyone's happy. The vine's getting the nutrients. There's just not a lot of moisture being retained. And it's why you see, and the best giveaway is obviously the mid-slopes in Burgundy, where the erosion keeps the soils relatively shallow. And you know that as you get down into the valley floor, the colluvium, which is just eroded soil, washed down the hills, is where all the cheap Burgundy is. And do not buy that. Buy Australian wine. It's not worth it. Yeah, I see a lot of Burgundy in Dan Murphy's, and they go, we got Burgundy. It's like, yeah, well, there's not all Burgundies are the same. So, but the Grand Crus are right in that mid-slope area. And this has been, I guess, the evolutionary discovery through trial and error of finding that holy grail of viticulture. So Bordeaux has it. They all have it in France, is that limestone soil gives efficiency. Happy, healthy vines means that you don't need a lot of soil, means that the grapes become very water stressed. And that, all that does, it shrinks down the berry size, gives you these really, really tiny berries, and much more flavor and much more structure. So that's sort of the 101 of viticulture. So now you can all go out and buy your own vineyard and burn up lots of money. But you get I guess the background here is that it's sort of important, because the French come at it from this side. Because we're talking of the vineyard, we are looking for vineyard conditions. We're very focused on how the vineyard operates. We're all about making the vineyard operate better, and not always through a highly sort of modern, like we're not anti-science. If anything, in Australia, we have to be very pro-science because we don't have cheap Eastern European labor. So we need to use technology. And because of that, we have some unique problems that I don't have in France, particularly straight rows that go through all sorts of underground soil terroirs and the like. We can't follow grid lines. Sorry, can't follow what are they called? The lines on the map, the elevation lines. We can't follow. We get very different average ripenesses. But it's about understanding, and where you understand the nature of the ingredients, you don't have to touch it as much. So in that middle point, those of you who are having some Merlot, I'll have a bit of a break from the heavy duty chemistry discussion. So Merlot, the unloved variety. It's interesting. I don't know have any of you guys seen Sideways? Oh, I think I seem to be missing sound. Hello.
Hi, great movie.
Sorry, there we are.
Great movie, yeah.
Great movie. So great movie, very funny, but single-handedly destroyed Merlot as a wine variety, especially in the United States. I think it came out and Merlot consumption dropped by 40%. And Merlot is a variety that was planted pretty bloody widely in America. And it overflowed into Australia. We got in our minds that Merlot was bad. It was cheap, it wasn't good wine. And it's crazy because Merlot makes some of the most expensive wines in the world. The French just don't tell you the variety in the bottle. So you got here like the Petrus on the left, and the Petrus on the left is yes, nice 6,000. Anyone got to spare $6,000 for a bottle of Petrus? So it's and then obviously you've got your Le Pen, which is not far behind it. Obviously dropping down to us with our $35, but it's a variety that to me, I personally love it. I've actually, I'm drinking it now because it's a very warm variety. It's got lovely body to it. It's not a tannic variety. And we'll come to that as we come back onto the story a bit later on, but it doesn't have the high level of tannin. So tannin, which you probably perceive as a cat's tongue on the inside of your mouth. There's a reason for that because it's clumping together all the proteins in saliva. But effectively, it can be quite harsh. It maybe needs a bit of age to soften down. That Merlot doesn't have that. It's got really lovely, it's very soft tannins. It's got lovely body to it. I call it my Sunday roast kind of wine. So it's just a really warm, welcoming wine. It has the ability to evolve into magnificent wines, given the right treatment, given the right use of oak, right aging, and very unique conditions. So Petrus there, obviously, is a fairly powerful brand, but it's 100% Merlot. So I'm just going to put this out here just so I don't get too off track. And it's effectively sort of saying to us is revisit the variety. It's perfect, and there's a reason that it's evolved in this area of the world from a food perspective. So you remember the Bordeaux Blancs, the Semillon Sauvignon Blancs that evolved alongside the Basque fishermen, and they're very salt-laden fruit. Well, the other main cultural dish of Bordeaux is this dish called Powalak Lamb, and it's a 45-day aged lamb, so it's very, very, very young. I don't think you legally can do a 45-day lamb in Australia. It's appellation controlled, so you're not able to do it anyway if you wanted to. But it means that the meat is incredibly tender. So you don't need a lot to break down the proteins, the gristle, the fat. You're looking for something that is much more in harmony, a little bit plummier than it. And so Merlot was their main variety of Bordeaux as the red variety for a long period of time. The whole right bank is effectively Merlot these days. And so it's a wine for me that I think anything we do a lot of wine dinners, speak to a lot of chefs, anything braised, baked, slow cooked, Merlot is your sort of go-to variety. Really easy to drink. It doesn't need to be as I said, not overly complicated, quite enjoyable. It's hopefully you're enjoying it. So how are we all going so far? Have I still got you? Good. We'll go back into the story. I have these little segues. I guess the question before we sort of finish off a little bit of the Bordeaux story is, I guess, the natural one, and we get asked a lot. So Burgundy family looking for Burgundy has planted all its Bordeaux varieties and they're doing well. What the hell is happening there? Because, the French don't do it that way. So here we are adhering to France and then we don't. I always say that the French approach is a guidebook. It's like the Michelin guide, and it's not the law. It's not and so there are some good tips that they give, but they're also, their appellation system stops them from doing any experimentation. Who's to say that Burgundy can't produce a great Cabernet, but they're not going to pull out a Pinot Noir vine to find that out. So around, I guess, why we are and where we are and why we fit in, what's viticulture like at Rylstone. So this is our vineyard right here. So when we planted it in 1998, my parents planted it in 1998. There was no vineyard for 50 kilometers. It's a very lonesome experience. The way that obviously I like to think of it, my parents' perspective is it's like Kevin Costner's Field of Dreams. So, the idiots who, plow in their cornfield to build the baseball diamond in the hope that, his grandfather and these best baseball players of all time. But there's a great line in it, which is, build it and they will come. And the whole mentality was effectively, this was sheep countryside. We came here with intent because it was about finding the terroir and producing the wine. It wasn't about, as a family down the Yarra Valley, we're like, why don't you open near us? Like we can share expertise, we can share cellar door, traffic, that you at least should be near other cellar doors, because it's going to be a lot harder. When you don't have 10 cellar doors around you, people have really got to travel to you. It's like, well, if we make good wine, people will travel. And that's the people we want to come to us. So you can see it here. So the way to look at this from perspective is from the fact of this post here to the end of that vineyard over there, and then down the hill further, it's about 1.5 kilometres. And the vineyard width's about 0.5 kilometre wide. So it's quite a substantial vineyard as well. So that's where the giveaway was for my parents, was to go out and do this by yourself. You need to be able to afford to do things. You have to afford to do everything yourself. There's no sharing of equipment, for instance. And so to have the team, have the equipment, have the tractors, harvesters, and all these bits and pieces, you need to be big. So this is 55 hectares of vines. That's a huge vineyard. It produces about 35,000 cases of wine. We don't obviously use all that yet. And when we started in 1998, we weren't sure about what we were looking at. Were we looking at a location that would produce world best wine, or is it just going to make some nice wine? And if so, the smarter approach is to plant to sell fruit. The danger in Australia is you plant the vineyard, build the winery, the bank manager's calling you all the time. You have to sell more, and you end up at Dan Murphy's selling your wine at below cost, and your brand implodes because no restaurant supports a brand that goes into Dan Murphy's, especially not these days. And so I guess the ability for us was to grow gradually. So we planted to sell fruit. So the history of Australian wine, if you're thinking back, is the first families of wine, most of them were fortified producers. Australia produced fortified for England. And it was only really the end of our Commonwealth trading agreement in the 70s. And then obviously which instigated the development of wine for consumption to some extent. But it's where you started having some of the greats, Cud Kay and Chester Osborne, and obviously Max Schubert was a little bit earlier in the 60s, but you started having a lot of these guys coming through in the 70s who started pushing forward and going, we should make wine. And they obviously had the vineyards, they started converting them over. And then in the 90s, the Len Evanses and the like, who started really taking us forward internationally into premium wine production. But we were still perceived internationally and domestically as Hunter Valley Semillon, McLaren Vale and Coonawarra Cabernet, and Barossa Shiraz. So the varieties that we planted in the 90s were varieties that represented that mix, which was Cabernet, Merlot. We planted some Petit Verdot, which is a Bordeaux blending variety, Shiraz and Viognier, which are Rhone Valley varieties, and obviously Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which are Burgundy and Champagne varieties. And that was the reason why. So, and through the process of seeing them grow and them being used by the wineries, and we were experimenting ourselves, we actually found that the wines we could produce were pretty bloody special. And there's some good reasons for that, which goes back to, one was, even though Burgundy and Bordeaux are different on that terroir, they're more similar than most Australian regions are with each other. So the big difference is just that maritime versus continental. And that plays a big part in the development for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. It thickens their skins being inland. But for Cabernet, which starts with thick skin, it doesn't matter. So this is why I always play around with this bit of slide. That was the Discovery Trail. It's the route to Grand Vin, or Grand Cru, and cheekily, that's the diameter of the Earth. So unfortunately, we're not on that route, but we're close enough. So first thing is, obviously, as I said, is that temperature. So this is where I always love saying, people say Tasmania makes better wine than New South Wales because it's colder. It's like, well, that's actually nonsense. Stanthorpe is as cold as Tasmania. Down here, it's latitude. Up here, it's altitude. So, obviously, as you move further north, you need more altitude to maintain the temperature. So you're looking for zone 8's Threadbow and Cradle Mountain. Not going to grow vines there. Zone 7, which is what you're looking for. So this is effectively France's temperature range. So zone 7 is right on that marginal edge. It's very cold. You're going to be dealing with frosts. And obviously most of Tasmania is zone 7, and then up into even up to Stanthorpe, zone 7. So where we located ourselves, just in the northern end, so Bathurst is zone 7. And you can see that here with the temperature ranges we achieve are very much in line with those of, interestingly, of right down here at Piper's Brook, 11.7, our average is 11.9. So we're sort of seeing the same temperature range at Rylstone as Tasmania. Interestingly, I've always put at the bottom Central Otago, which to me is one of the great wine regions. Very, very cold, very marginal. And that's the big story about premium wine. But the big one was obviously, for us, obviously finding inland was important to be like Burgundy. So we wanted to be the west side of the ranges. There's a lot of cool climate areas around that are already inside that area. So oranges and Murray Batemans and hilltops and Tumbarumbas and some in Victoria, Mount Macedons and the like. But what we were really looking for was very much that same geological story that we talked about Pangaea and the development of limestone in France with the Paris Basin. The story here is not 150 million years, it's 450 million years ago. And this is the Ordovician era, if you remember your high school geology. And this is the era of Gondwanaland. And you can see here, I sort of make it pretty obvious so that you don't have to fully follow my words, but there was a chain of volcanoes, effectively where Sydney is, running north-south. On the seaward side, the eastern side, I guess you'd call it that, there were obviously big crashing surf from the massive oceans that were off out that way. But on the leeward side, on the the inland shore side, or towards the continent, was a really lovely, still, calm sea. And along that coastline, along this sort of, I guess, the Red Star line, with enormous deposits of limestone were left, because you had coral reefs in particular. And this was the Ordovician era. What made it significant was that it was the era of invertebrates. So invertebrates are shellfish. So it's the era they were the dominant life form. They dominated entirely, and they left that band of limestone. Which we were looking for. And you see this limestone in Jenolan Caves. And you see this limestone in Wombian Caves. The danger, the problem is that it's 450 million years ago. So you had since then, I think Sydney and the Blue Mountains are about 200 million years old. You've got all these volcanoes that came in afterwards about 250 million years ago, and most of that covered it, and it's buried at depth. It's irrelevant. There's no point having limestone 10 meters down, even 5 meters down, let alone 50. You want it near the surface so you get that interaction between the limestone and the topsoil, and to make it more alkaline. And so how do we find it? Do you walk around with a pH testing kit, up and down the East Coast? You can, if you're more than welcome to do it. But the way you find it is you go looking for limestone mines, which is cement. And right next to Rylstone, there's this tiny little town called Kandos. It was a mining town. So Rylstone was established in 1830. Kandos was the early 1900s when they discovered limestone there, and they dug a big pit quarry there, and they used that limestone to make the cement that built the harbour bridge and a lot of the buildings in the city of Sydney. So we knew that. We were happy. That's what we're looking for. Inland, it's cold. It's got limestone. Let's go find it. We were lucky. That's how we found this incredible valley where the limestone even comes to surface in spots. Very similar to Burgundy, but also quite similar to Bordeaux in that alkaline soil and soil depth perspective. So there you go. That was, if you wanted to know. So how little patches, the aqua is the Rylstone volcanics, which is 200 million years old. So as you can see, it covers most of it, but it reappears in certain points, obviously, where the lava flows stopped or whatever. And we're right there in the middle. So I won't go too much into more of that technique. What I'll do is I'll PDF up this presentation. I can send it to you. You can read it at your leisure and go and have fun poking around and learning more about it. But coming from this perspective, gave us that ability to get those pH levels getting that temperature, getting us inside this box. And that was what my parents were looking for. That's what we achieved. So, and with all the varieties that we produce, it's interesting, we now produce 17 wines now, including the Pinot Gris that will be out this Christmas. They're all average well over 90 points. We've won best wine in Australia with one, Cool Climate Trophy with another. We came third in the world with another. It's the vineyard, and it's not winemaking. You know, it's very hard for a winemaker to make every wine good. It's much easier to let the vineyard do all the work. So, and as I said, you know, Burgundy to Bordeaux is the same. Is you know, Coonawarra and Barossa are more different than Burgundy and Bordeaux. So, let's talk about the wines again. So I'll get off the science back into the booze. Here is I guess we talked a little bit about, obviously you've had the Merlot, and on the left you've got the Cabernet. So this is, so we've got a couple of the great Cabernets of France there. Your Chateau Margaux, your Latours, your Lafite Rothschild, or Rothschild, as we call it in Australia, and against your Petruses and your Lepins. So just good to know, because as I said, the French don't ever tell you, you know, it's just assumed knowledge. You would know that wines of the left bank versus wines of the right bank. And this is where I said this has been a story of three countries in Bordeaux. So the three countries are France, obviously, England, and Holland. So the right bank is what we classify as old Bordeaux, original Bordeaux. It was the Bordeaux that was planted back around the time of the Roman era, Bordeaux of the Basques. It was the Bordeaux of the English. So, you know, when the English were effectively running Gascony, running Bordeaux, they were focused on the vineyards around Pomerol and Bordeaux Colt, a little bit of Entre-deux-Mers, but the between the rivers. But really, they were up around here. So Saint-Emilion is your town of importance there. And to give you an idea of how important this trade was, so they managed to effectively underwrite most of their wars with France with Bordeaux wine. And they would send the ships down to Bordeaux full of stone as ballast, but also as a bartering good. And they sent so many ships that all the streets of Saint-Emilion and Bordeaux are made with English stone. And they come down with the ships with the stone, they go back with barrels. So they come, just there's that much that they could pave entire towns with English stone. So you can see this English stone on the right. So that's not French stone. And but they were being the first mover. They controlled all of Bordeaux. So this area where, which was, you know, that shallower soil, and with the limestone, because it's obviously the same as on the coastline to an extent. And the Dutch around this time were also building their trading empires up. You know, if you've read Nathaniel's Nutmeg and the battle for the Spice Islands, you appreciate that this battle raged everywhere that they were together. They fought, you know, each other tooth and nail for trading privileges from North America to Asia to France. And the Dutch came down. It's fascinating. They built the first negociant. So the first wine trader was Beierman. It was a Dutch company. And they were left with the scraps. So what they did was they had Graves, which they planted with Semillon because they were looking for whites for the markets, were very in demand. But it wasn't that high quality. Obviously, that Pesach Leonard was there, but very small plantings were of the quality that they were looking for. They were really looking for red wines. And around this time, the Dutch had developed some pretty handy skill sets at draining swamps, building dikes, and clearing, you know, pushing back the sea. And as I said at the start, trading wine and trading all this stuff is very much about logistics. So you don't have forklifts back then. You had effectively guys pushing barrels and horses and carts. So the closer you were to the river, the more economic your winery was. So what they did was they picked up all this area. It's called the Medoc. The Medoc was swamps. It was crummy land. It was the stinking swamps of Bordeaux. And they drained it, built dikes, and they pushed the water back, and they built and put vineyards all along the Medoc. And that gave them a massive advantage, because if you've been there, you'll know that there's actually jetties at most of the wineries along the left bank of Bordeaux. So they actually would push the barrel straight onto the ship, straight out of the vineyard, straight onto the ship, straight to market. And they started beating the English at it. And there was a big difference between that. So the Dutch were left bank, the English were right bank. Obviously, it's all French, but the influences were much more defined by those historical connections. That's why I love the history, because it explains a lot. So all of a sudden, you've got these left banks. So they're not the soils that were historically farmed. So they have to do things a little bit differently. And so you can do that differently. There are techniques, but there are also varieties. So the right bank, Bordeaux, as I said, Pomerol is your defining region, and Petrus is your defining wine. It's not $1,100 a bottle. I wish it was. It's very famous for this boutonniere, which is the buttonhole. It's a blue clay that only is under Petrus. So what it does is, summer, it bakes hard, and it forms effectively an impermeable layer. So it does the same thing. It gets the soils very shallow. So you have this shallow, gravelly soil mixed in with limestone. The blueness is derived from the limestone, and it keeps the soils quite shallow. So Merlot has reasonably thin skins. So obviously Pinot and Chardonnay have incredibly thin skins. That's why they've got to be inland, because that harsher environment thickens the skins up, it bruises them up. Merlot, because it has thinner skins, it's really important. It doesn't have as much water. So the way, to give you an example, our prep last vintage this year, 2021, we lost all our Merlot and most of our Shiraz, because it happened, that big rain. Remember all the floods you had in Sydney? What a year we've had. And the huge amount of rain fell, and it was just before vintage of these varieties, and they swelled up and they popped, they burst. And once that happens, the disease gets in, they're ruined. So you can't do anything about it. And so Merlot, is very sensitive to moisture and water. So once again, it needs to be shallow. There's similar soils, so that older school soil. And so obviously Petrus dominates it, but Le Pin is next to it, Lafleur, and there's a couple of others. But the left bank is probably the most famous now. So your Margots and the brands that come from the left bank are quite dominant in terms of perception now. And it's different soil. As I said, so this is the drained swamps. There's no shallowness of soil here. They're gravelly, it's deep gravels. So fast flowing, like they drain well. There's limestone mixed in there. It's all been washed down the river and rubbled. And so the alkalinity is up, but the soil depth is vast. And so the way this vintage, and for ourselves, we were able to produce some great Cabernet despite all the rain. Because Cabernet, the way I think of it is like Pinot, Merlot, Shiraz are like balloons, and the water gets into them and they expand and they pop. Cabernet is more like a ceramic jug. The water goes in, it just pours back out again. It's got very thick skin. So remember how I said with Merlot, it doesn't have that high tannin content. It's really warm, welcoming, gentle wine. Cabernet is famous for its tannin. And tannin, the main sources of tannin in wine are skins or oak. You've obviously got stems, you've got skins, but the two main ones, almost all your tannin are from skin or from oak. So the thicker the skin, the more tannin. So Cabernet's got thick skins. Think of it as a ceramic jug, very thick skins. It can handle the water. The water just gets in there. It decides I don't need any more to drink, and it just stops, and effectively pushes it, somewhere else. And so the Dutch worked out that Cabernet was able to handle this environment, so they planted Cabernet. So Cabernet Sauvignon wasn't planted on the right bank. So right bank was Cabernet Franc and Cabernet and Merlot. Cabernet Sauvignon is a grafted sort of evolution of genetically modified Cabernet Franc. And they worked it out that it could handle these really deep. So it's one of those varieties. So as I said, there's rule books and there's guidebooks. Then there's discoveries to be made, like Australia's discovering more about varieties as we plant in more varying locations. But there's also an understanding, I think, about the location that you're in and the vineyard, how you're managing it, how some varieties thrive and work better. So in our areas where there's, there's runoff or wash zones, areas where the soils run down our slopes and pulled up. So the areas like Burgundy's valley floors where the soils are deeper, so the Pinots are worse, is actually perfect for Cabernet. So Burgundy probably should put Cabernet there, and they probably produce some pretty amazing wine. So for us, we have the benefit in our vineyard of having some fantastic Cabernet planted in some of these areas. So with regard to the different styles of Cabernet. I always love showing a bit of comparison. The French sort of sits there in the middle at $1,350, puts us all to shame. But you've got naturally your classic Coonawarra Cabernet. So you remember how I said that the Germans sort of they understood the terroir, and a lot of those German areas on that chart that I provided. So with the soil pH and the temperature, Coonawarra, Eden Valley, McLaren Vale have all got limestone. The Terra Rossa is limestone, like it's on limestone. It's red earth on limestone. Limestone Coast is the biggest giveaway of all. That South Australia's got a lot of limestone. So they nailed it. But they're quite a lot warmer. If you remember, they're about 4 degrees warmer than us, so much warmer than Bordeaux. So what that means is you get much riper flavors. And it's a very different type of red. So when you're talking, we go back to that start, we talked about finding balance. So balance is discovered or dealt with or worked with in a vineyard, about vigor. So having the right amount of fruit to each vine so that it can handle it. It can ripen it effectively in balance. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the ripeness of the alcohol or the sugar. So maintaining the acid load, you're really important. Acid degrades as sugar goes up. It's about flavor ripeness, but it's also about tannin ripeness. And tannin ripeness, interestingly, is one of the most exciting ones that really people are putting a lot more work into these days. And so with the ripeness and the performances in these areas, you have a much riper style. So it's much warmer, it's taken them through, but they obviously have nailed it in terms of the soil pH and the like. But it's also very vintage specific, and I'll come back to that about us. So Vaz Felix is great. Like the Virginia Wilcox, who's is their winemaker, has been for a number of years. It's probably one of the best winemakers in Australia, but one of the best educators too. So if you're sort of interested with what I want, but you want to go to the next level, I'd go and look her up. Like she's phenomenal. And she has this, if you're interested, it's in the Guild of Sommeliers, there's podcasts, and they have an interview with her, and she talks at length about tannin and Cabernet, and it's awesome. I loved it. I don't know if you guys will, but strongly recommend it. But what I'm saying is she's one of the great winemakers in Australia. And that's a go-to wine. If I see Vaz Felix Tom Quality, I'll buy it. So much more that Bordeaux environment. So what they're doing here, I guess over here, is it's a warmer climate. So you've got to pick a lower alcohol to keep the acid intact, because as the alcohol sugar goes up, the acid goes down. So you can, they were looking for a higher acid load, or 6.5, interesting, quite acidic. But you move through obviously to the Bordeaux varieties. They're around the same, 14, 14.5. And then you move out to ours. So what is interesting is I put 2 victors here. So this 2006, we got 3rd in the world with our Cabernet Sauvignon in London. So it was right up there in the pH, so much lower level of acidity with a decent alcohol range, not out of control. Everything was in balance. 2016, which is our current one, a bit warmer year. The alcohol is a bit higher. We had to pick it a little bit less on the pH ripeness, so getting a much higher acid level to achieve a much the same type of balance in the palate. It wears its alcohol well, but for me, our reds, we should be picking around 14, 14.5. But this is, we've just had 2016, we thought was going to be a hot year. Then we had 2018, 2019, 2020. It's been a crazy period. It really knocks around your wines in particular, because it plays havoc with the ripening curves of them. Fortunately, us being much colder, we've got a lot more leeway to deal with a warming climate. Problem is our bugbear is frost, and that's what we're worried about right now. And then you've got out in the end here, the Marquis, which is what you're having now. So this is, so same. So we've got amazing, it's amazing. So pH, I'm pretty happy with those numbers. Like you get that full, the acidity is a little bit lower. So I find sometimes because Cabernet Sauvignon has a very acidic profile. So not only is it famous for tannin, it's also famous for acid. So the way that you can notice with tannins in your palate with Cabernet Sauvignon is obviously tannins are at the back. So it's why it provides length. So it's really important for a wine structural perspective and aging profile is to have that high tannin content. But you'll notice also that Cabernet, you'll feel it right at the front of your palate, which is where your malic acid in particular works most. So your main grape or the grape acid that you want to have. And so from this perspective, looking at this, I wanted to get a little bit lower acidity because this isn't a reserve wine that we're making. So the Victors they're designed to age for 20 years. So effectively that acid will degrade, it will go up. Well, the pH will go up, the acid will go down as it ages naturally. And that's where you start having the ethers coming through. You start having the wine notes that people, when we're joking about wine and we're talking about jock straps and old leather and things like that, those types of notes, they're called ethers. And they tend to be hidden by acid. And that's why having high acid, I think of it like pass the parcel. Every year, the wine goes around the globe, effectively, around the sun, an acid layer comes off, and then gradually the wine starts to come out. And that's where you get 20 to 30 years of aging. So for a wine like Le Marquis here, it's probably, I was looking for more a 10, 15-year aging profile. I was looking to create a wine that would be enjoyable earlier, younger. It's one of our staple wines. And the way I also achieved that, and the way we also achieved that, was that I blended in a little bit of Petit Verdot. So Petit Verdot has got a really lovely fruit finish to it, really bold flavors, especially on the palate and right at the back in particular too. So between those two, we're able to use blending, which is the French art of amendment, rather than winery trickery, ferments and yeasts and the like, which are more intervention. So keeping that low intervention down track. So this why it's a little bit different. So if you're looking at the other wines, they're much more designed for age, much more new oak, looking much more highly acidic. Whereas this Le Marquis is designed for beautiful drinking now, and it will be for the next 10 years. But the Victor, on the other hand, is a 20-year wine. Just a last, I guess, little one. I talk a lot about tannins, and people go, "What the hell are you talking about?" Sometimes. When I talked a little bit about Virginia Wilcox and her views about tannin ripeness, so tannin ripeness is called tannin polymerization. So tannins are polymers. I don't know if anyone here did their science or has an interest in it, but the way I think of effectively making this accessible science is that tannins start as little Lego pieces. So I don't know if any of you got kids or you've walked across a floor with little Lego pieces, they hurt a lot. And so that's why when tannins are young, they tend to be sharp and quite tough. So that's why you have short, sharp tannins in young wines, because the Lego pieces, the polymers, are still sort of stuck in a jumbled box in the wine. And what happens in polymerization, all it is effectively the tannin pieces start forming into chains, but effectively they start building something. They click together. As they get these chains get longer and longer and longer, they become smoother, so almost like a flat surface. So you get this smoothness that starts appearing in red wines with high tannin content as they age. And this is the normal way that you look at tannins. And a lot of Australian big reds, wait 10 years, it'll be amazing wine. So that Le Marquis is amazing. It was amazing at 2020, last year. I had a restaurant saying they'd sell it for $150 a bottle, which is crazy because what happens, and it's the reason why Vaz Felix is planting more of their Cabernet down in Great Southern from Margaret River, is they're chasing cooler temperatures. So if you remember, we're a cool climate vineyard, and there's a reason for that. So there's I've got to be careful I don't get into too many terminologies, but think of from veraison. So, okay, so you got bud burst where there's a nodule develops, and veraison is this time where the skin of these little nodules starts to get color, they start to soften up, and effectively the berry starts to grow and starts to accumulate sugar. So effectively it turns from a nodule of acid into a grape. And that's called veraison. And the time that goes from that point through to harvest is called hang time. So normally it's maybe 60 days, 30 days, 30 to 60 days, 45 days. For us, veraison is the end of January and harvest is mid to late April. So February, March, April, almost 90 days of hang time. And what's been discovered by Virginia Wilcox, or explained by her best, but also discovered by us, discovery is probably not a thing, stumbled into it, is probably a more accurate, is that the tannin polymerization, so these Lego blocks actually form together, they resolve, they ripen through extended hang time. So the longer they spend on the vine, the longer the tannin chains become. So you get these younger wines with soft tannins, resolved tannins. And so that enables you to drink Cabernets younger. So some of these other ones up here, these are magnificent wines, but you know, you remember your big McLarens, you know, they need a couple of years to really get their best out of them. The Tom Quality will be great, very young. And ours, the 2019, is magnificent, really easy to drink now because the tannins are resolved. So you're getting the benefit of a younger Cabernet, which you don't normally see. And that's where you get your black currants, you get your cherry ripe. I call it cherry ripe, but you get chocolate and the like. You get this really lovely, easy to drink wine. Young is because it's effectively the tannin ripeness. So long pathway there I took you through. So effectively that was, I guess, a little bit of an explanation, trying to bring through Burgundy's perspective, why they developed and how it developed, you know, the battle between the English and the French and the Dutch and the English and planting of Merlot versus Cabernet, the rationales behind it, obviously the foods that went alongside those wines in particular, and how that influenced the varietal selection, which effectively meant the wine that was produced. Higher acid whites, lower tannin reds traditionally, and now the more tannic reds on the left bank because they're having to deal with deep soils with a lot more moisture content. So, and then obviously, hopefully told through a little bit of our eyes with our experience that relate to what we're doing and what we're hoping to do. So watch this space. There's some more good wines we'll make in this area. I'm doing a Cabernet Shiraz for a bit of fun this year. I want to do a Shiraz Cabernet, but we lost most of the Shiraz to the rain. That's the Great Australian, it's called the Great Australian Blend. So Penfolds Grange was Shiraz Cabernet originally. It's first 10 years it was a Shiraz Cabernet. Now it's just Shiraz. So Max Schubert didn't make a straight Shiraz. There's a reason for that, was because back in the 70s, a lot of these early stage and 80s, a lot of these early stage Australian winemakers were going to France and spending time there. And they're exposed to, back then, a much more agricultural approach to winemaking. And what they were seeing was not the science-based, but hey, we're a bit underripe in Bordeaux or we're a bit underripe in Burgundy. And what would happen is a little tanker of Shiraz would appear either from Spain or from the Rhone Valley, and they would sort of appear in the tanks and a little bit would go in. And they started seeing Shiraz and what it would do to Cabernet and what it would do to Pinot. And that's why we in Australia started blending Shiraz with everything. The Bordeaux, Hunter Valley, I don't remember, Hunter Valley Burgundy, which you would have seen in bottles if you have any from the 80s, was actually more Shiraz than Pinot. It was, and the same with, you know, a lot of the great, you know, say Cab Shiraz and Shiraz Cabernet. So I always wanted to produce it. I think it makes a bit of fun. Look, we are a French style producer. I have my own little label with a mate. It's called Ralston Estate, where I've got a little bit more free reign. I'm making that in that variety. And also we're going to produce another reserve in our Bordeaux blend. I think, you know, what we're producing, what we're doing, if we could give it another wine. So we've got obviously our straight Cabernet, but maybe more of a Merlot Cabernet, much more in that, if you remember your Le Pin and your Petrus Vale, what we could do with a 22-month age Merlot with a little bit of Petit Verdot, a little bit of Cab Franc. So it's a bit like, you know, that scene in The Castle at the end where, you know, Daryl, you know, they're talking about how many tow trucks they're going to finish at, and that's sort of us. Like we're at 16, 17 wines and we keep seeming to add more. We've got no self-control, and that's sort of been, but, you know, when you've got a vineyard that does what it does, you know, we're just the benefactors of it. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening to me. I hope you felt like you could jump in there. Please, you can always. If you've got any questions or comments, love to hear them. You're all muted, sorry.
I'm a novice, but that was just fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You sort of cleared up a lot of things and made it, yeah.
Oh, thank
I
you.
really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's not that complicated, the wine industry. It's like, I don't know, I've got doctor friends, they probably hate me for it. It's like doctors, it's like they won't say, go and have a Panadol. It's like they'll use the generic name, and then we make it overly complicated. Wine's sort of the same. Like, it's most of the reasons that we do things is because they were undertaken in France or Italy, or Spain, or wherever else wine was grown, Georgia and Hungary and the like, was response to, conditions, response to situations, and they just lucked through it. So, you don't need a science degree to understand wine. We haven't changed much in 2,000 years. To be honest.
I'll debate that part.
well, but that's
that was wow.
Oh, yeah. Well, but we still ferment pretty much the same as we did 2,000 years ago. The big difference is we understand quality control, we have better piping, and we have better valves and seals. But these days you speak to some guys and they really like, a lot of the winemakers, there's the new one is these terracotta eggs. Like, they're going back to the Greek era. And, I've got mates go, oh, I've got this new egg. It's amazing. It's going to be the best one and can't wait to try it out. And I'm like, oh, okay. Great. So just like the ancient Greeks, like, exactly. I'm like, okay. So 2,000 years of sort of science and, we're back to, tragoidas and tragedies. So.
Yeah, well, I love the talk, and I echo your comments. When my dad died when I was 21, which is a long, long time ago,
yep.
I found a stash of wine in his cupboard.
Yep.
And if I knew then what I know now, I would never have drunk it. It was Rothschild, Lafite.
Oh, no. Oh, no. God.
The works. I was
would...
very, very popular with my friends.
Mate, you were an early stage Bitcoin investor. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely.
You didn't know it. You're like the guy who's lost that hard drive in like the rubbish dump in like Wales or something, paying, a bounty to find it. Yeah.
Yeah, but as a 21-year-old, I loved it.
Oh, my dad locked up his wines, but didn't lock up his ports. So I used to drink a lot of port when I was young. So now I look back and go, oh my God, I probably was drinking these really old ports. My mates would be at parties and one would have they'd have like Bacardi Breezes and the beers. And I'd have a bottle of port. It wasn't intentional. I desperately tried to trade away a glass of port for a beer, but I was always rejected for some reason. But the same thing, mate. God knows the ports I was drinking. But yeah, anyway, I've recorded this. I've got that on record. So.
I hope your dad can't hear.
Yeah, I think he has. But thank you. Are you still buying Bordeaux since then, or you've moved on to more expensive pastures in Burgundy?
Oh man, I've got a farm down the south coast, so the wine down here is really bloody awful.
Oh. If you go inland, there's some great guys. It's just varietal selection, mate. If you're on the coast, you need really thick skins. Like all of the great coastal varieties, you need to be able to deal with disease really well. The humidity is just too high. The Portuguese deal with it. Like Touriga Nacional, like you sort of said, you're going to see the Hunter Valleys. It's going to be increasingly Spanish varieties and Southern Italian varieties. And I guess it'll be the same with a lot of these areas, as we deal with, whether it be climate change or whether we just deal with, hey, I want to make better wine than some C-grade French knockoff. There is definitely that move in Australia, which is good.
They've got to start by pulling out all the Chambourcin.
All they what?
The Chambourcin.
Chambourcin.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
It's not even a major variety. Like, I know what it is, but I don't want to sledge any of them because I know how hard it is to be a vigneron, and I know how hard it is dealing with disease and rain, and if I can tell any of you, don't get into viticulture. It's much smarter just buying it and drinking it. So, one of my friends was like, "Oh, I might buy it. There's something." Yeah, he saw one of these cheap vineyards up for sale in South Australia recently, and didn't take much digging to realize it was one of these. It was effectively only sold to China, only China winery. And I was like, "Mate, just give me $1 million." So you and I go for like the best year ever, and we just spend $1 million, and I can guarantee you will enjoy that waste of $1 million, vastly more than you will owning a vineyard, because it's going to cost you a lot more than $1 million. And you'll be dealing with, ongoing back problems and pruning issues and constant anxiety, what the Mother Nature's going to do to you this year. So have I induced any of you guys to want to go to Bordeaux or?
Yes.
We can't.
One day when we're allowed to travel again.
Absolutely.
Like this climate, I'll go anywhere.
I know. Sorry, I'm going to go to the living room.
Well, there's 5 of us that work together here.
Oh, fantastic.
We're a team. Well, we all work in the same office, and we're doing a road trip as soon as we can get out of Sydney. Yeah,
Well, come to us at Ralston where.
we are. That's where we're going for
It's-
sure.
Oh, great. Because it's interesting. I had some friends. It's amazing. I've got mates who've never been our way because they had this vision. Oh, going over the Blue Mountains is a really long distance. It's not Katoomba's an hour and a half. So thanks to all of the road work that's happened, to get to Ralston's just on 3 hours. And they'll be once they build the tunnel from Anzac Bridge to the West Connect, it will be just under 3, which to me is a big psychological change. But they were like, I didn't realize these guys took their kids. They managed to organize babysitters in every town. They said that was the best thing they've ever done in their life because they went to a pub every night. But they did Orange, so Bathurst, Orange, Dubbo, Western Plains Zoo, Mudgee, Ralston. And they said it was just a week and a half, driving around. They had tents as well. So they had some tents. So if they didn't have accommodation, they had a tent somewhere and they sort of mixed and matched. I'm seeing someone shaking their head and I'm like, I'm with you, but depends how drunk you are. The tent could be a really good positive thing.
Too old for that.
Yeah, but there is some. Look, we're looking to build some accommodation and a restaurant on our place in the next year because there is a lack of options around Ralston to meet the demand. There's some. What's there is phenomenally good. It's just hard to book. So book ahead, book early. And come with your drinking boots on, and I definitely, if you're around our area, I'd try and do a farm stay or as one, or stay in the pub because the pub down in Ralston is like an 1830s, 1840s pub. It's real classic. It's got a great publican who's young, and was a Sydney restaurateur. He's originally a country boy, and he's now gone. He's obviously gone back. It's always been his dream to have a country pub, so he's looking at putting a distillery in and a brewery, and it's got a big beer garden. So the area is on fire. So I don't know how much work from home flexibility you've got, but there's been a lot of people who've come back out there, and some lawyers, a lot of tech people.
Yeah. That's where we're all from, a law firm. So
And I'm ready to go.
and we've just done I just did the big switch because I sold my place in Sydney and then I'm in Bathurst and I've bought land. Yeah, and I've bought land in the Capertee Valley, and I know Capertee very well because I've been to the vineyard so many times. So,
Rebecca, fantastic. Well, Capertee is like the most social valley ever. Like you do realize, like you guys are going to be. It's a valley of drunks. I shouldn't say that recorded too.
No, I know.
But they're
That's
all
why
great.
we're here, Will.
They're all great bloody friends, and they all get together. Like they go around to each other's houses, and they all get drunk, and it's all these really interesting people. Like the ex-CEO of Aristocrat. There's like a whole. A previous chairwoman of Telstra, and so and then there's a bunch of farmers, and they're all
it's really good. Yeah, it's great, and I have to thank Derek and Floyd for bringing me to the vineyard for the first time. And
I was going to say Derek and Floyd are like the social glue. How's the liver looking?
Don't ask.
They are. I don't know, for everyone here, Derek and Floyd are this magnificent couple, and they were, I think, Floyd was head of Cancer Australia, or
Cure Cancer, and he's loads of charity and pro bono stuff.
But they have an airport in Katoomba that they're developing so that you can drive to Katoomba and get a chopper out to our area. But they're now talking about developing that a bit more. So it's interesting that the chopper ride is it's 50 minutes from Sydney, so to us it's not very far. It's but
great way to see the district as well.
It's Walgan Valley, so it's the same. It's Capertee Valley, which is similar to Walgan Valley, and you think Sorry, I got my daughter
I can hear
downstairs.
that.
I'm sorry. She's having a meltdown. It's all right.
Bring her up.
She normally is, but last night I was on a call and she went boom and she turned it all off. And I'm like, and I was with some friends. So I was like, I knew to call them back, but you guys, I was like, maybe just, I don't know. She's welcome to come up, but I think she's having a meltdown. She's 3 years of age. That's the age where tantrums just take over, I think. So,
Definitely.
so she's probably being allowed to walk up the stairs, but I need to go down and pick her up or something. So I'll go down in a second. But yeah, no, please come out our way. We're Ralston,
Love to.
regional
We're
areas.
coming.
I got to, because I'd be interested to know, because a lot of people tend to avoid it in Christmas. My view is everyone's going to be wanting to go everywhere, but the coastal towns are going to be full. So you're going to have, you'll get 2 weeks in a coastal town, but then you're going to have, what do we do for the rest of the next 6 weeks if you're doing school holidays, or for the rest of the time, sit around in your house in Sydney?
Yeah,
That's what we used to, isn't it?
Our kids have all been to your place and they love it.
Oh,
But
yes.
just got one serious question. We're all
Yes.
sitting in the dark, and yet there seems to be light outside your window. I don't get it.
Yeah, okay, so I had my newborn 4 weeks ago. No, I didn't have that. I'm taking credit. Definitely I shouldn't be taking. And sorry, I'm looking at this. So I should look at this screen. I've got 2 screens. So the camera's over here. So we had to be down for that, obviously, and then we stuck around. And I've been doing these virtual wine dinners in Sydney each Friday and a lot of Saturdays, and they're getting up to about 200 people now at the moment, which is crazy. So I'm helping pack and deliver, and so it's been beneficial to be down here. And also I'm avoiding pruning. It's a great excuse. So this is obviously part of our cellar door behind me. It's beautiful old grafter room, and the grafter room was built in 1830s by convicts, and it was famous because it also became the stables, but the stables for a Melbourne Cup winning horse called the Grafter, and that's why we call it the Grafter. So grafter room. So which is also apt because the Grafter is also a wine, something you do in wine as well, grafting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's beautiful. We have our VIP tastings and groups in here, and yeah, it's beautiful at our way. So mum and dad I'm just here to take all the credit. So by doing this, they did all the work. I just come along and do a couple of virtual masterclasses.
You're doing a terrible job.
Terrible job. Yeah, but so my father and I are responsible for the wine. So that's my remit is wine, and obviously vineyard oversight. But we've got a great vineyard operations manager, and dad's there. And yeah, as I said, too many cooks will spoil the stew, when it comes to pruning. So I'm doing that for the recording benefit, but yeah, we're lucky to have a family business, that's for sure. So, but it's been an interesting period, that's for sure, as well. But thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It's
That's
awesome.
a pleasure. And if you want to join our mailing list or check on social media with these dinners, I'm doing Hearts Yard in Newtown this Friday. I think there's a couple of tickets left if you're in Sydney. Doing Thai-Im, which is like an Ottolenghi type of restaurant in the Rocks next Friday. We've done quite a few with them. The chef's incredible. He's out from Tel Aviv as well. I nickname him Yotam. Following a week after that, we're doing Riley Street Garage. Then we're back to Thai-Im, and then we're doing Lotus Dining. So we've been doing them each time. So they're a bit of fun. So a bit like this, but food and chefs talking, and a bit more of a, just something nice to do. And the food's amazing. Or if you like to buy any wine as well, there is a deal. I know we're probably all pickled. I know you've already ordered it, but if you are, I know there's a code my sister's sending out. I'll put it in the chat anyway, but it's sorry, I'm going to make step. And I'll also, before you go, I'll also put the PDF in here if you want to download it as well. So,
That's okay.
What is it?
Okay, the PDF will be good.
yeah, but to me, it's about sharing the information. So, hold on a second. Auto Masterclass PDF. There you go. So, please, if you have any questions or comments, get in touch with me. I'm always happy to chat. directly to anyone. And we look forward. We cannot wait to see you up in Ralston. And spread the word if you'd like to. So I think I do this every Wednesday night for different. So next week I'm doing Champagne, and the following week I do reserves. Then I'm back to Burgundy, then Bordeaux, and then it's just a cycle. So entirely up to you, but just appreciate you all coming here. So thank you. If you've got any more questions, please.
Thank you, Will.
That was brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Very much. It was so much fun. Thank you.
Oh, pleasure. And guys, enjoy lockdown. We're almost over. So I know. I said I was going to stop recording.